For nearly 500 years, Hurst Castle has stood at the edge of England watching the sea. It was built to stop an invasion that never came. Its guns were aimed, loaded, and ready, yet they never fired in anger. It became the prison of a king who would lose his crown and his life, though the castle itself passed that moment in silence. Later, it was expanded into one of the most heavily armed fortresses in Britain, only for those weapons to become obsolete almost as soon as they were installed. And now, after surviving religious wars, civil war, industrial firepower, and 2 world wars, Hurst Castle faces the only enemy it has never been able to deter: the sea. This is the story of a fortress that shaped history not through battle, but through fear, and of how time itself may succeed where armies failed. Chapter 1. The Narrow Place. There is a place where England narrows to a decision. A mile-long finger of shingle reaches into the Solent, dividing the open sea from one of the most strategically important waterways in the nation's history. Wind scours it relentlessly. Tides tear at its edges. The currents here are unpredictable and often violent, shaped by the meeting of Channel and Solent waters. The land itself is never entirely still, shifting grain by grain beneath every storm. At the very tip of this exposed spit stands Hurst Castle. It was built to stop invasions that never came, held a king who could not escape, and now faces an enemy no army can defeat. For nearly 5 centuries, this fortress has guarded the western gateway to the Solent, the narrow maritime corridor through which ships must pass to reach Portsmouth, Southampton Water, and the heart of England's naval power. Any vessel approaching from the west was forced into this confined channel. There was no alternative route, no wide water in which to maneuver safely. Geography alone made this place unavoidable. Yet strategy does not fully explain why Hurst Castle matters. What sets it apart is not a single moment of battle or a famous victory, but endurance. Few fortifications in Britain can claim such continuous relevance across radically different eras of warfare. Tudor paranoia, Civil War revolution, Victorian overconfidence, 2 world wars, and now environmental collapse have all left their marks here. Hurst Castle was never frozen in time. It was repeatedly reshaped by fear. Reaching the castle today still reinforces that sense of isolation. Visitors arrive either by ferry, gliding quietly through salt marshes alive with wading birds and winter geese, or on foot, walking 2 miles across loose shingle from Milford-on-Sea. With every step, the castle grows larger ahead until its walls finally dominate the horizon. The journey itself echoes the logic behind its construction. This was meant to be a place apart. Chapter 2. A king's fear. Hurst Castle exists because Henry VIII was afraid. By the late 1530s, England stood dangerously isolated. Henry's break with Rome had transformed what began as a dynastic marital dispute into an international emergency. Pope Paul III excommunicated the English king and actively encouraged Catholic Europe to intervene by force. When France and the Holy Roman Empire, traditional rivals, signed the Truce of Nice in 1538, the implications were unmistakable. England now faced the possibility of a coordinated invasion by the 2 most powerful states in Europe, backed by religious authority and overwhelming military resources. Henry responded by personally inspecting England's coastal defenses. What he found alarmed him. Medieval castles and town walls, designed for siege warfare and arrows, were relics in an age of gunpowder artillery. High walls presented inviting targets for cannon. Narrow gateways could be smashed open. England needed something fundamentally new: fortifications designed not to withstand sieges, but to annihilate invasion fleets before they could land a single soldier. In 1539, Parliament approved the Device Forts program, the most ambitious military construction effort England had ever undertaken. More than 30 new fortifications would rise along the coastline, from Hull to Milford Haven. Funding came largely from the dissolution of the monasteries, converting church wealth and often church stone directly into cannon, bastions, and gunpowder. The cost ran into hundreds of thousands of pounds, a sum equivalent to billions today. The Solent received particular attention. Control of this waterway meant control of England's naval future. 4 key positions were selected: Hurst Castle, guarding Southampton Water; East and West Cowes, protecting the Medina River on the Isle of Wight; and Hurst Castle, dominating the narrow western entrance at the Needles Passage. Chapter 3. A machine for killing ships. Construction at Hurst began in 1541, on a site that barely seemed buildable. The shingle spit was uninhabited, unstable, and exposed to the full force of wind and tide. There were no quarries nearby, no settlements, no roads. Every stone, every timber, and every tool had to be transported by boat or hauled across loose pebbles. The work was overseen by Thomas Bertie, an experienced master mason already proven at other device forts. He was not building a residence or a symbol of authority. He was assembling a weapon. The Tudor castle that emerged was compact, low, and relentlessly functional. At its center stood a 12-sided tower, circular within, but faceted externally, so that incoming cannonballs would glance off rather than strike squarely. It rose above a basement and 2 main gun decks, with embrasures arranged to provide all-round fire. Around this central tower, 3 curved bastions formed a distinctive trefoil shape. Their geometry allowed artillery to fire in overlapping arcs across the water, creating zones of concentrated destruction. The largest bastion faced the landward approach, protecting the only viable access across the spit. The others were oriented directly toward the Needles Passage, their guns aligned to punish any ship attempting to pass. This was not a place meant for comfort. Living quarters were cramped and dark. Light was limited. Everything served the guns. When construction was completed in 1544, Hurst Castle concentrated an extraordinary amount of firepower into a footprint barely 50 meters across. 71 gun positions were distributed across multiple levels, though only a fraction needed to be manned at any one time. A small garrison, little more than 20 men, could command the entire western Solent approach. In the 16th century, that was enough. The castle's mere presence altered naval calculations. It made attack irrational. Chapter 4. The gate that was never tested. No invasion fleet ever challenged Hurst Castle. That absence can make the fortress seem redundant, but deterrence was the point. Any hostile ship attempting the passage would have faced artillery from both shores, trapped in a narrow channel with no room to turn or retreat. Hurst did not need to fight. It only needed to exist. The castle's guns were not symbolic. Contemporary inventories list a carefully chosen mix of artillery: culverines for long-range fire, demi-cannon for ship-breaking power, sockers and smaller pieces for sustained bombardment. Brass guns, prized for their reliability, sat alongside heavier iron weapons. Each type filled a specific role in a layered killing zone across the passage. Yet firepower alone was not the revolution. What truly set Hurst apart was its concept. Medieval defense assumed an enemy would arrive on land and stay. Hurst assumed the enemy would be mobile, fleeting, and vulnerable only for moments. The castle was built to exploit those moments. Garrison life reflected this reality. The permanent crew was small: a captain, a master gunner, trained gunners, soldiers, and a porter. In peacetime, many gun positions stood unmanned, but in crisis, reinforcements could flood in from nearby towns and forts, transforming the castle from a quiet outpost into a fully armed barrier. The castle also functioned as part of a wider defensive system. Hurst coordinated with Hurst Castle, guarding Southampton Water, East and West Cowes protecting the Medina River, and Southsea Castle, shielding Portsmouth itself. Signals, visual and messenger-based, allowed warnings to ripple across the Solent. Troops could be ferried rapidly to threatened points. Hurst was not a solitary gun platform, but a command point embedded in a network. Even so, limitations were apparent from the beginning. Surveys noted that while the castle's guns were formidable, its isolation made sustained defense difficult. Supplies, reinforcements, and even fresh water depended on safe passage from the mainland. Hurst could dominate the water, but it could not survive indefinitely alone. Still, for more than a century, it stood watch. Guns loaded, fires unlit. The absence of battle was itself the measure of success. Chapter 5. A King in Chains. In December 1648, Hurst Castle finally entered the center of English history. The English Civil War had torn the country apart for 6 brutal years. By the winter of 1648, the fighting was effectively over. Royalist armies had been defeated. Scotland's intervention on the king's behalf had collapsed, and England was exhausted by war. King Charles I was a prisoner, held at Carisbrooke Castle on the Isle of Wight, while Parliament debated what to do with him. Charles I, however, had not accepted defeat. Throughout his captivity, he continued to negotiate, delay, and intrigue, convinced that compromise, foreign intervention, or simple exhaustion would eventually restore him to power. He entered talks not to reach agreement, but to buy time. The new model army reached a different conclusion. Senior officers, including Henry Ireton, believed the king was fundamentally untrustworthy. Charles I had privately admitted that he negotiated only to create opportunities for escape. As long as he lived, they believed England would remain trapped in a cycle of rebellion and renewed war. On the 1st of December 1648, soldiers arrived to remove the king from the Isle of Wight. His destination was not London, nor any royal residence. He was taken instead to the artillery fortress at the end of the Shingle Spit. Hurst Castle was chosen precisely because it was unreachable. Chapter 6. 19 Days. The castle was never meant to hold a king. Sir Thomas Herbert, who attended Charles during his captivity, left a detailed account of their arrival. The reception was grim and unmistakably unceremonial. This was not a transfer befitting royalty. It was the delivery of a condemned man. Charles was confined within the central keep, in chambers hastily prepared for his arrival. Herbert recorded that the rooms were so dark that candles were required even at midday during the short winter days. At night, a single wax lamp in a silver basin provided the only light. The walls were thick, the air cold and damp. Outside, December storms battered the exposed fortress. Wind howled across the spit, driving rain and salt spray against the stone. The shingle offered no shelter, no sense of enclosure. Even brief walks along the spit, permitted under heavy guard, only emphasized the king's isolation. On one side lay the sea, on the other, more sea. Freedom was measured in yards. On the night of the 19th of December, Herbert was awakened by the sound of a bridge lowering and the approach of horsemen. Orders had come for the transfer. Charles was removed under cover of darkness and taken inland, first to Windsor Castle, then to London. He spent 19 days at Hurst Castle. 6 weeks later, he was executed outside the banqueting house at Whitehall, becoming the only English monarch to be treated and put to death by his own subjects. Hurst Castle fell silent once more. What followed was nothing less than a transformation. Beginning in 1861, engineers reshaped the fortress on a scale Henry VIII could never have imagined. The medieval moat surrounding the Tudor castle was filled in, to provide foundations for new construction. On either side of the original fort, enormous granite-faced wing batteries rose from the shingle. The west wing extended more than 200 meters along the shoreline, housing dozens of casemates. The east wing added another long stretch of gun positions, turning the once compact fortress into a sprawling fortification 360 meters in length. The Tudor core, once the entire castle, now formed only the central section of a much larger machine. The cost was enormous. Hundreds of thousands of pounds were spent reinforcing foundations, importing granite, and installing the heaviest artillery Britain had ever deployed in a fixed position. By the 1870s, Hurst mounted some of the largest rifled muzzle-loading guns in existence. Individual weapons weighed up to 38 tons and fired shells weighing hundreds of kilograms. Each gun required a trained crew of up to a dozen men to operate. Life inside the Victorian castle was defined by routine and readiness. Casemates doubled as living quarters, with soldiers sleeping only a few yards behind their guns. Ammunition magazines were carefully isolated, ventilated, and guarded. Narrow-gauge railways carried shells from storage to firing positions, while drills rehearsed the precise choreography required to load and fire weapons of such immense size. Hurst Castle had become a monument to industrial firepower. Yet even as the guns were installed, their moment was already passing. Worse still, military technology continued to advance at a relentless pace. The massive rifled muzzle-loading guns installed at Hurst were rapidly outclassed by newer breech-loading weapons. Reloading a muzzle loader could take several minutes, requiring the gun to be run back, sponged out, reloaded from the front, and repositioned, all under the assumption that enemy fire would politely wait. Breech-loading guns changed everything. They fired faster, farther, and with greater accuracy. Fixed coastal batteries, no matter how powerful, struggled to keep pace with mobile, long-range naval warfare. The great Victorian fortifications acquired a nickname: Palmerston's Follies, impressive, expensive answers to the wrong future. Hurst adapted where it could. Faster-firing guns were installed to counter the growing threat of torpedo boats. Machine guns appeared to defend against close attack. Later still, anti-aircraft weapons were added as the sky became a new avenue of assault. But the underlying problem remained. Static defenses were losing relevance in a world defined by speed, range, and flexibility. During the First World War, its primary role was not direct combat, but observation and control. As part of the examination service, the garrison monitored shipping entering the Solent. Neutral vessels suspected of carrying contraband were ordered to stop for inspection. Those that complied were escorted onward. Those that did not receive warning shots. Searchlights swept the Needles Passage at night, probing the darkness for submarines and surface raiders. Minefields, boom defenses, and patrols formed overlapping layers of protection. Hurst Castle served as one component in a much wider defensive network, rarely visible, rarely dramatic, but constantly vigilant. After 1918, many of the castle's older guns were removed, and the garrison was reduced. For a time it seemed that Hurst's long military life might finally be ending. That assumption proved premature. Following the fall of France in 1940, the threat of invasion returned with terrifying speed. Hurst Castle was reactivated as part of Fire Command Needles. New coastal guns, searchlights, and fire control positions were installed. Anti-aircraft weapons were added as German bombers struck Southampton and Portsmouth across the water. The garrison watched the war unfold from its exposed position. They saw distant cities burn. They listened to the thunder of bombs carried across the Solent by the wind. They trained, maintained their weapons, and waited. In June 1944, they witnessed history on a scale no Tudor or Victorian builder could have imagined. The vast invasion fleet, assembled for D-Day, passed through the Needles Passage, warships, transports, and landing craft bound for Normandy. Once again, Hurst Castle watched as the world moved past it. The shingle spit on which Hurst Castle stands is not solid ground, but a fragile, dynamic landform shaped by tides, storms, and the long movement of sediment along England's south coast. For centuries, this natural system maintained a precarious balance. In the 20th century, that balance was disrupted. Coastal protection works elsewhere along the shoreline interrupted the natural drift of shingle. Over time, the spit narrowed and lowered. Storms began to strip material faster than it could be replaced. Emergency interventions became routine and light. In December 1989, severe storms breached long sections of the spit, raising the real possibility that the castle could be permanently cut off from the mainland. Further storms in the winter of 2013 to 2014 displaced enormous volumes of shingle in a single season, reducing the height of the spit by several meters in place. The most dramatic failure came on the 26th of February 2021. Following days of heavy storms, a major section of the Victorian East Wing collapsed into the sea. Foundations that had supported nearly 2 centuries of masonry were exposed and undermined. In a matter of moments, history fell away into the water. The response was swift but costly. Thousands of tons of rock and shingle were transported along the spit. Foundations were stabilized. New sea defenses were constructed to buy time against an accelerating threat. Yet the underlying problem remains unresolved. Rising sea levels, increasingly severe storms, and changing sediment patterns all threaten the narrow strip of land on which the castle depends. The enemy no longer arrives by ship. Today, visitors walk the same shingle, feel the same wind, and look out across the same narrowing water that shaped 500 years of fear, ambition, and resolve. They pass through Tudor gunrooms, Victorian casemates, and Second World War installations, layered one atop another. Kings have fallen. Empires have risen and faded. Technologies that once seemed unstoppable have become museum pieces. The spit still reaches into the Solent, and at its end, battered but unbroken, the castle remains, watching a future no one can fully predict.